Hey, welcome back. RP Plus, RPU, Dr. James Hoffmann here, and today we're going to be talking about another really interesting topic, peaking and tapering for sport. Now, I'm going to give you my lecture on this, but what I would encourage you to do is if you are somebody who is actively competing in sport and has gone through this process of peaking and tapering before, definitely consider purchasing the textbook called Tapering and Peaking for, I believe, Optimum Performance or Optimal Performance by Inigo Mujica. Amazing textbook. Tons and tons of research on this topic, and that's primarily where a lot of the information that I have gathered has come from as well. So let's get right into it. What is peaking and tapering? Well, today we're going to kind of outline what some of these things are. There's not always a clear-cut definition. We're going to go through the main physiological, psychological, and performance-based benefits. I'll give you some examples of what this can look like, and obviously it's going to be different from sport to sport, person to person, but just kind of a real quick, simple example. And then I'll give you some key points, some take-home messages about tapering that I think you should know. So let's go on to the first one. What is a taper? Now, this is one of those things, unfortunately, if you comb through different scientific literature, if you comb through different books and articles, there's not always a clear definition. And if you look on the slide, there's a number of definitions that are used here. And I just like to put them out there just to show that sometimes there's not always a consensus and not always a really clear cut definition to some of these things. So one of the common themes, if you really comb through a lot of these definitions, is a reduction in the training volume, a maintenance or possibly an increase in the training intensity, and a predetermined time point at which these things are occurring. So one of the really interesting things about tapering is essentially it's a series of events where we are really trying to get our athlete as primed for performance as humanly possible. And the way that we do that is through good periodization practices and phase potentiation, but really the icing on the cake, the culminating factor really becomes what we do with some of our training variables, particularly the training volume and training intensity. And doing a good taper essentially will allow us to take our athlete who's been training maybe for years, for months, doing really hard training for a long time. They have generated lots and lots of fitness along the way, but unfortunately they're not always able to express that fitness to its fullest capacity simply because of the concurrent fatigue effects of training. So one of the major goals of a taper is essentially to keep our athletes training, but bring their volume of training down so low that they are actually able to dissipate as much fatigue as possible while holding on to the fitness that they have generated. So it's kind of a weird dichotomy, and this is something that will make a lot of sense if you've heard Mike speak on the volume landmarks discussion, which this will be very helpful in this discussion as well. So again, not always a clear-cut definition, but we see some common themes, right? There's a timeline, and there is some manipulations that we're going to be doing to the training volume and training intensity. So essentially, if we're thinking about a taper, the taper is, again, that pinnacle culminating step in maximizing athletes' preparedness for competition. The taper is going to help express all of that previously dormant fitness, which either is too suppressed from the effects of fatigue or just have not had a chance, an opportunity to manifest themselves yet. Now all of that pre-generated fitness is going to be maximally expressed at a specific point in time. So we call this process tapering and peaking. Now for powerlifting and weightlifting, sometimes you'll see some different ways of doing that. For endurance sport, you'll see some different ways of doing that. And certainly for team sports, you'll see some different ways of doing that. But this is a common theme that we see all across those, and they can be applied slightly differently from sport to sport. But essentially what we're trying to do is get our athlete maximally prepared for competition by dropping out as much of their training fatigue as we can. So you can see on the picture over there, Johnny Hendricks and George St. Pierre, a couple of my favorite fighters. I like to watch UFC. So again, we're trying to get them prepared at a certain point in time. Now, one of the things you want to think about when you're setting up your annual plan is, when do I actually need my athletes prepared for competition? You don't want to be the gym hero, right, who hits the huge numbers and huge performances in the gym, and then when they actually when game day comes around, all of a sudden, they're nobody, right? They're not doing anything. And conversely, you want to make sure that, that when they actually are competing, they're doing well. And when they're supposed to be fatigued, like when they're training really hard, that they are training really hard and getting fatigued, right? So there's kind of a dichotomy in a relationship there. We want them peaked at the correct time. Now, what does peaking imply? Peaking implies kind of reaching the top, right? As far as it will go. What's something else you got to consider when you get somebody to reach their peak? Well, what's the next step? What's the next process that happens after the peak? The valley, right? They go back down. So one of the problems you can have too is you might accidentally peak your athlete out prematurely, too early. So for example, you might decide to do a tapering or peaking protocol during the playoffs, and they might blow a team like a football team or a soccer team out of the water in the playoffs, and that's really cool, but what's going to happen during the championship game, right? There's nowhere to go but down. So there's a timeline that we have to consider and make sure that we are getting them peaked at the appropriate time, because we can blow it, right? They can be not peaked for competition or and then not perform well, or they can peak after. All sorts of problems, right? So we're considering a timeline here, and that's of course why we have the annual plan and why you guys have watched me do all those videos on annual plans at this point, right? Oh, I had enough, I understand. So let's go on to the next one. Things to consider when you're setting up a tapering protocol for your athlete to compete, right? Obviously, we have to reduce the training load. Now, what a lot of people forget is that we have to reduce the training load from all sources. Most people only think about time spent in the weight room. But you can imagine lots of sports are multifaceted. I am involved in rugby. You can imagine rugby involves sport practice. It involves scrimmaging. It involves conditioning. It involves speed, power, agility, change of direction. It involves weight training. It involves all sorts of things, right? So if I'm only considering their weight training stuff, I will be doing them a massive disservice throughout their taper because they're still doing a lot of other stuff. So we have to consider a reduction of the training load from all sources. So everything that goes into MRV, we are considering, right? We, of course, are managing fatigue because they are still going to be training at this time. One of the problems that you see with some tapering protocols is that they are actually too easy in the sense that they actually stop training altogether, where they say, all right, I got 2 weeks before the competition or the big event, I'm chilling, right? They basically go into active rest. We don't want to do that. We still need to make sure that we're actually training and holding on to our fitness, because we can actually undershoot on the training volume and actually start adaptive decay before the competition, which is no good either, right? So we want to make sure we're still training hard, still managing fatigue. We want to make sure we're managing the physiological outcomes that we want. There are specific things, as determined in our needs analysis, that we were training for to be successful, right? We had power, speed characteristics, strength characteristics, endurance characteristics, all sorts of stuff. So we want to make sure that we are taking steps to address all of those different adaptations or address all those different performance parameters, and making sure that we are adjusting the volumes, intensities, frequencies of those things specifically, right? We're going to consider the type of taper. There's some different ways to kind of go about it. We're going to consider how long the taper is going to last. Ooh, that was a good one. And we're going to consider, again, what are the major performance goals of the taper? Are we trying to decrease our time trial time? Are we trying to hit a huge total PR? Are we trying to have more repetitions at certain velocity zones for their soccer match? Things like that. What are the major outcomes that we want to see as a result of doing a good taper, right? So let's keep going. Now, the taper, again, is that performance enhancement that occurs as the result of what we call the recovery of physiological capacities that were impaired by past training. So that's a really fancy way of saying, right, we had dormant fitness that we have been training for months, possibly years, and we have not been able to express it yet simply because we have been concurrently training the whole time, and that has lied dormant. We maybe not have had a chance to express things like maximal power output, movement speed, or really hitting our gnarly race pace, something like that, right? So the way that we do that is, again, by trying to maximally reduce the accumulated physiological and psychological stressors of daily training, dieting, and just of sport and life in general. Now, one of the really neat things about doing a taper, and those of you who have heard me talk about recovery before, this is kind of another side benefit. One of the cool things that happens as a result of doing the taper is a progressive reduction in the training volume, right? Which we're going to get to in a little bit. One of the big benefits of that is that it helps restore training tolerance and kind of helps alleviate some of the plateauing effects of doing high volume trainings in the long term. So one of the big benefits of doing a taper, aside from actually maximally expressing fitness, is actually restoring your training tolerance so that when you go back to doing hard training later on, you can continue seeing gains and we don't see that plateauing effect as aggressively. So we have kind of a built-in fatigue management, but we also have kind of an anti-plateauing effect, a progressive effect over time simply by reducing the volume of training, which is pretty neat. So it allows you to kind of peak out, and it also allows you to benefit from that same hard training that you go back to in the long term and in the future. So very, very good strategy. Now, some of you might be thinking like, okay, sounds great. Sounds like a lot of potential benefit. Do I need to peak and taper? Well, we're going to get to that in a little bit later, but one of the things you want to consider right off the bat is doing a taper sounds really awesome. There is always a question of how much time do I want to take away from doing really hard overload training to make long-term gains? So one of the problems that we see a lot, and I'm not trying to pick on any particular groups, but the one that I see a lot is the CrossFit athlete who decides they need to do a tapering protocol every other month for some random like New Jersey competition or some random Philly competition, right? That really doesn't have any major impact on how they stand in their community, right? So one of the problems that you run into with tapering is, yes, it is a progressive reduction in things like the training load, and that's great for performing well, but it's not great for making long-term gains. So we want to pick and choose when we taper wisely. It's not something we necessarily want to do all the time. We're probably going to save it as a tool in our toolkit for really, really important things like championships, regional or like national level competitions, things that we really want to perform at our best, right? If you're at like the South Jersey Open for whatever, is that really a big deal? Probably not. It's probably a fun social event that's totally cool. Do you need to start taking away weeks and weeks of hard training for that event? I would make a case and say probably not. You could probably get a very good benefit of doing like a deload or something like that instead of doing a full tapering protocol. Food for thought. So now let's get into what are some of the major benefits of doing a taper protocol for competition. If you look on the slide, first we have here physiological benefits of tapering. There are a number of different biomarkers that we can look at to indicate that either recovery or performance enhancement is occurring. So we don't necessarily need to go through all of these. A couple that are noteworthy, right? One of the first couple ones that we can see usually right off the bat are decreases in blood CK levels. CK is creatine kinase. It's an enzyme found in the muscle, and it's something that gets secreted into the blood when there's a lot of structural damage to the muscle tissue. So literally when the muscle tissue gets ripped open and ripped apart from hard training, some of the contents of the cell start to eke out and it makes its way into the bloodstream, right? CK is one of those things. We can measure it and say, you know what? CK is usually prevalent when lots of structural damage has occurred. It's not necessarily a cause and effect type relationship. It's indirect at best, but it's useful nonetheless. So one of the things that we usually see is during the taper, CK goes down, which is an indicator that physical stress has gone down. We can start to see some hormonal markers, things like cortisol and testosterone can change. Now, if you comb through the literature, it's not always clear, but there seems to be at least a trend in my opinion, in the overall literature that shows that either an increase in testosterone, a decrease in cortisol, or some combination of those two things are leading to an improvement in recovery. So typically when we see elevations in cortisol or when cortisol is relatively high compared to testosterone, that is indicative that the athlete is in a stressed state, which is okay during training, not great during competition. Conversely, when testosterone is high and cortisol is low, or when testosterone is just high in general, usually that's indicative of them being in an anabolic state, right? Now again, not cause and effect, but pretty reliable. So we can actually start to look at things like testosterone, cortisol, or the ratio of those two things, and we can usually see some positive changes somewhere. Not always, but a lot of the time. We can see some major changes in our hematological factors, things like red cell volume, hematocrit, reticulocytes, right? So a lot of our cardiovascular factors start to improve, so we can actually see like improvements in the actual blood's ability to deliver oxygen, things like that. So some really cool stuff. If you look at things like, this is on the next slide, sorry, I didn't warn you ahead of time. If you look at things like max heart rate and submaximal heart rate, if you look at the result of tapering, it's very inconsistent. So it would be incorrect to say that tapering will consistently have a positive effect on achieving a max heart rate or having a lower submax heart rate for any given type of endurance type event or submaximal event, right? That would be incorrect based on the literature, the available literature. It seems to be inconsistent at best. Sometimes there's a positive result, meaning like somebody was able to achieve a higher max heart rate, or somebody was able to achieve a lower heart rate at the same workload that they usually are at, which is cool. Is that always the case? No, it's very tit for tat. So what we're going to say is for cardiovascular, aside from blood markers, for max heart rate and submax heart rate, pretty inconsistent. So no clear benefit at the moment there. What we can see are some very, very large improvements in a lot of our metabolic markers. So a couple things that are very, very noteworthy under metabolic, things like VO2 max very, very consistently seem to creep up, maybe not a ton, but definitely a little bit, which will be an indication that their ability to take in oxygen and use it for energy has gone up. So very, very good for endurance sports. For strength power sports, maybe, maybe not. For field sports, it can be useful. For like, weightlifting, powerlifting, basically not that useful unless you have a hard time following yourself up. Otherwise, not a big deal. We can see some increases in efficiency and economy, meaning we can actually measure how much energy is being expended to perform a given task. And if we do a tapering protocol and do it again, we can find that per that same task, that person will actually expend less energy to do it. Pretty cool. So the same amount of actual work costs less energy for us. Really cool, right? We can see some actual changes in enzyme activity for a lot of our different bioenergetic pathways. So things that are involved in glycolysis or cellular respiration can become more prevalent or more active, indicating that those processes are kind of in overdrive and doing really, really well. We can actually see some cool changes in lactate, and this is one of those ones that kind of gets a little exercise fizz really quick. We can actually see increases in peak blood lactate, which might sound negative, but for a strength power sport, that would actually be a very, very positive effect, meaning A, you can tolerate higher levels of peak lactate, but also you can generate higher levels of peak lactate. How do you do that? Well, somebody who is very, very well trained in the glycolytic pathways, meaning having to do really, really high intensity work, now can do even more, right? So this would be a great adaptation for somebody who is in like a pure strength power sport, for example, like a short distance sprinter. Now they can actually generate more lactate, meaning do higher intensity work than they could before, or at least more of it than they could do before. So that's cool. It might sound negative, but it's actually positive for our strength power athletes. And then we can actually see decreases in submaximal blood lactate, which is a positive adaptation for our endurance athletes. So we say, okay, run at 7 miles an hour for 30 minutes, and we can look at, on average, kind of what the lactate situation is. After a taper, what we can do is say, okay, run at 7 miles an hour again, and we can do that same analysis, and what we find is, on average, blood lactate will be a little bit less, which would be an indication that they are maybe not relying quite as heavily on carbohydrate, or at the very least, the relative intensity of the exercise has gone down for them in some capacity, which is pretty cool, right? And then one that I think is noteworthy that a lot of people maybe don't fully understand, and this is something that we've addressed on our webinars more than a few times at the current time, is an issue of calorie balance. So one of the cool things that you can consider during the tapering period is that you are reducing their training load, very similar to what you would do in a deload, right? No brainer there. What we generally do is tell the athletes to keep eating whatever they've been eating, right? Keep an isocaloric state at this point. They should have already been isocaloric, so we should have already kind of established what that means for them. And we are not going to change that at this point. And what's going to happen when they move into the taper? Well, their training volume is going to progressively go down, right? But their training calories are going to stay the same. Now you might think, like, that sounds bad, right? Aren't they going to get fat? Not really. What we're really going to see is a positive fatigue management effect, where we're going to make sure that that extra little, now that they were isocaloric and now that their training has gone down, they might be slightly hypercaloric. That will allow them to refill lost glycogen from months, weeks and weeks of hard training. So now they might get a little slight boost in their calories as a result of just staying isocaloric and reducing their training volume. That's actually a good thing so long as they're not gaining weight. They're actually repleting a lot of the lost glycogen. So there's a big, huge fatigue management benefit there that's actually measurable as well. So really, really cool. Let's go on to the next one. Now, as you can see on this one, we have He-Man, and I think He-Man is probably the best way of describing what happens here at the actual muscle fiber level. So this is where some really cool exercise physiology findings can occur. So one of the first few things that we actually see that's a huge benefit to strength power sport, during the taper, as we progressively reduce the training volume, is we see a conversion of many muscle fibers to a type 2X state, which is again that big, strong, explosive muscle fiber state, right? Not always, we don't see all fibers moving that way, but we can see many fibers that are in like that undetermined, like unclassified zone will start switching over, and many that have kind of started to drift over will drift back towards type 2X. So now the muscle that I have is moving back to a more explosive and forceful state, and that's simply from reducing the training volume. You didn't even have to do anything, right? All you had to do is train less, and that happens, which is pretty cool. Then we can actually see the cross-sectional area for a lot of those fiber types will actually increase for both type 2 and type 1 muscle fiber. So the actual cross-section, they'll actually get bigger, right? We'll actually see some acute hypertrophy as a result of bringing the training volume down. And then culminating up with all of these things, we start to see some really crazy stuff happening. One of the things that we can see is increases in peak force of about 30%, which is kind of a common number that you see. Now that doesn't mean that you're going to add 30% onto your bench press, but the actual twitch characteristics, that like electrical stimulation and tension characteristics of the muscle fiber can go up about 30%, which is huge. I mean, that's huge. Can you imagine if you could just gain 30% in like gross strength for like a powerlifting meet? Obviously, it doesn't work that way, but that would be pretty incredible. So at the muscle fiber level, that's a huge increase, 30% increase in the amount of tension, essentially, and twitch tension that they can generate. And the intrinsic ability for it to shorten at a fast rate goes up, somewhere around 67% in a lot of cases they've measured. I mean, that's huge, right? One of the biggest limiting factors to movement speed and explosiveness is the intrinsic muscle shortening velocity, right? And one of the results of actually taking fatigue down by reducing the training volume is now you're actually allowing the muscle to move fast, right? Before you couldn't move it fast just because you were training, and speed characteristics, power characteristics are so sensitive to fatigue. But you take that fatigue away, and now you can actually see the muscle moving as quickly as it can, right? Which is really, really cool. So the actual shortening velocity goes up. You can imagine now I've said we're getting more type 2X, our muscle fibers are getting bigger, they're actually generating more force, and they're moving faster. So what does that obviously going to mean, and what is that going to lead to? Huge, huge, huge increases in absolute fiber power output. Some have been measured upwards of 250%. If that doesn't blow your mind, you might as well just turn this off at this point. You just quit RPU at this, because that's so cool. 250%. Now again, that doesn't mean that you can sprint 250% faster or jump 250% higher. We're talking about the intrinsic ability of the muscle to be forceful and fast, right? And it goes up quite a bit. So I like He-Man as a good example here, right? You literally power up from the taper. It's incredible at what we can see at the actual muscle fiber level in terms of what is happening. So there are some very distinct physiological benefits to doing a good tapering protocol for competition. Let's look at the next one. In addition to physical effects, there are certainly psychological effects, and something that we like to talk about. I don't think we don't obviously like Mike and myself and many of the other people at RP are physiologists. We tend to focus on physiology and maybe not speak on psychology as much, but that's not to say that those factors aren't worthwhile and aren't worth discussing as well. And one of the cool things that we see with the taper are also distinct psychological effects as well. And just to name a few, not all inclusive, we start to see decreases in perception of effort, so people feel like they're not having to work as hard. We see decreases in mood disturbances, which is very common when you're doing hard training and overreaching, right? You get cranky and you get moody, totally normal. And Mike will attest that I get that way plenty of times when I'm stressed out, right? So one of the big benefits of tapering is that starts to go down or go away. We see decreases in perception of fatigue, so people start feeling less tired, less fatigue all the time. We see increases in things like vigor, I love that word, and improvements in quality and quantity of sleep. So we can see kind of a very, very complete physical and now psychological recovery effect, which is pretty cool, right? So last but not least on this, we can see on the next slide, performance benefits. So obviously we've outlined that there were physiological benefits and there were psychological benefits, and certainly those almost always, not always, but almost always translate into actual performance benefits. Now, you still have to show up and you still have to perform. Just because you tapered doesn't mean that magic's going to happen, right? If you suck you still suck, right? That's not going to change. The taper just makes the probability of your success go up by increasing the physical traits that make you successful, right? That's really what we're dealing with here. So what kind of performance benefits would we expect to see from doing a taper? Well, typically what have been shown are decreases in time trial. So if you're doing a long, like an endurance event, your completion time will go down. And if you're doing like a short distance, like a sprint, either it's like 100 meters or a 40 meter or a hurdle event, same thing. Time trial length will go down, meaning you've completed the race faster. We can see increases in strength in things like powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman. We see increases in speed, like absolute movement speed. And then we can actually see improvements in things like jumping ability, right? And this can be sport related, or it can be like very traditional, like track and field style, like long jumps, high jumps, things like that, all across the board. So most performance measurements will tend to go up. With the advent of GPS, I would expect to add some things to this list, especially like distances covered during a match, number of accelerations per game, number of efforts, things like that. Unfortunately, at least at the current time, I don't think that they've actually taken that data and then compared it with tapering effects just yet. But I would expect to see those pop up, hopefully in the near future. So those are just some obvious ones that we've talked about. Let's keep it going. So we get it, right? Tapering's probably a pretty good idea if you are competing in competitions that are meaningful, right? That was kind of the preface that we said there. It's maybe not always in your best interest to taper for competitions that are whatever, or fun, or just meant to be social, right? But for ones that matter, ones that affect our ranking or our ability to go to regional, national, world championships, and obviously things like Olympics, play a big role in this, right? So how do we start setting up our taper? Well, there's a number of different ways that we can do it. All of them are good, right? So you can see linear tapers where the training is reduced in a very systematic linear slope fashion. Ooh, excuse me. We can see exponential tapers where the training load is reduced in a systematic, more exponential shape, which can either be slow or sudden. And then we can see some stepwise tapers, which are, as the name implies, shaped like a staircase, right? Where we kind of have a pretty systematic, very similar to linear, except instead of smoothly going down in a linear way, we take chunks of our training loads off at a time and continue on. So typically what we find is all of them seem to be really beneficial, but the ones that are more progressive, like the exponential tapers, seem to work a little bit better, where we have a big drop off and kind of an exponential asymptotic shape, and then it kind of levels off. Those seem to work really, really well. However, you can't go wrong with all three. All three seem to work just fine. If it's too confusing, you can just bring it down linear or stepwise, and that's fine too. Either way works well. Okay, so we now have to start thinking about, how am I going to start modifying some of my training variables? The intensity is a good place to start. So when we start reducing the overall training load, one of the problems that we run into is the adaptive decay problem, right? We can actually start to see reversibility of our training adaptations if we are not generating sufficient overloads. We know that overload's primarily going to be coming from volume and intensity, volume being a really, really big factor. If we take that volume away, we might not be able to maintain the previously gained fitness. Well, it turns out there's kind of a cool, interesting little way around that. And the way that we actually maintain that dormant or fitness that we're trying to express is by maintaining, and in some cases, actually increasing the intensity throughout the duration of the taper. We can maintain enough of an overload to keep our maintenance characteristics simply through intensity for a short period of time. Now, this is not something that is indefinitely sustained, meaning you can't just do super, super intense training and expect not to detrain eventually. But in the short term, this strategy works very, very well. So essentially, what we're going to be doing throughout the taper is really, really reducing our training volume, possibly below normal maintenance levels, depending on how we set it up, right? If we're below maintenance, by default, we're going to start detraining, right? However, if we maintain high intensity and possibly even increase the intensity throughout, it will kind of expand the window in which we can maintain our fitness before we start to actually do adaptive decay. So we're kind of I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but essentially we're just expanding out the time that we can kind of get away with this, right? We're on a ticking time bomb, right? We're going to start detraining sooner or later, but the intensity allows us to just hold on a little bit longer than we normally could. So the short version, we're going to, at the very least, maintain the previous intensity of training. Probably more likely, we are actually going to increase it a little bit if possible, throughout the duration of the taper, which is pretty cool. Okay. For volume, we've already kind of talked about volume a little bit. We said the training load has to come down. There's no way around it. There's a lot of things that you can screw up in the taper, and it's not a huge deal. The volume is basically the one thing you cannot screw up because that is the big deal. Everything else is negotiable. The volume is non-negotiable. So what we have to do is actually reduce the training volume from all sources, right? And this is going to be a big drop. They've actually looked at some dose-response relationships for the taper in terms of how much training should be reduced. And they found that there's not enough, meaning if you don't reduce the training volume enough, you don't get the expression effect that we want. And you can actually reduce the training volume too much, and we don't see that nice performance benefit. We probably start seeing adaptive decay. And they've actually found a kind of a sweet spot, seems to be somewhere around 41 to 60% of the pre-taper training volume, right? So roughly half of what you were doing in the previous mesocycles leading up into this event, right? So this comes from all components of training, not just what you're doing in the weight room. So all the sprinting, conditioning, sport practice, scrimmaging, you name it. If it goes into our MRV calculation, it gets reduced by roughly 50%. That's huge. That's a lot. And it can be kind of scary for some people because they feel like, whoa, I'm not doing anything. This is so abysmally low. Am I even training anymore? Well, that's not the point, right? The point is we're actually taking your volume down because we know the volume is going to have the biggest relationship to how much fatigue was generated, right? So in this case, we're taking that training volume down very, very low to maximally alleviate that fatigue and now express all that fitness that we've been culminating for months and months and months, right? So the training volume needs to go down by roughly 50% of the pre-taper training volume. It's a lot, but we know that by maintaining the intensity, we will be able to stretch out how long we can hold on to that fitness. Let's go on to the next one. Many people ask about the frequency of training. Should you alter your frequency of training? Typically, there is kind of a dichotomy here. For those who are maybe beginners to more moderately trained, we can recommend a reduction in the training frequency, somewhere around 30 to 50% of pre-taper training frequency, meaning the number of times per week that they show up for training. For those who are more well-trained, we're talking people who have been training for like 10 years or more, there's probably a good reason to actually maintain the current, whatever frequency and whatever regiment they were doing before, keep it the same and just reduce the volume of training done in each one of those sessions. There is a good argument that there is some neuromuscular component to that where they might not maintain the feel and the technique for highly technical movements of their sport. So you can imagine if you have somebody who's a weightlifter and you say, all right, basically don't snatch for 2 weeks or maybe snatch one time for 2 weeks, they're going to panic, right? Because they need to maintain that motor control and that feel for the movement under load, right? So for more well-trained folks, we're generally going to say maintain the normal frequency, maintain the normal regiment, and just reduce the training volume. For those who are less trained or more moderately trained, we can play with the frequency if we want, but there's nothing wrong with maintaining the same frequency of training so long as the volume is adjusted. So I think there's some wiggle room there. 30 to 50% frequency reductions have been recommended, but I would say maybe not necessary. Okay? Let's go on to the next one. In terms of the duration of the taper, there is not a clear consensus in terms of how long the taper should last. Now, I'm going to give you some recommendations based on my observation and understanding of the literature. But I will preface this by saying this is my evidence-based opinion. There is not a clear consensus on how long the taper should last. That being said, most athletes that we work with in the spectrum of day-to-day work, probably around 2 weeks is a very good place to start. This is for most moderate trained, intermediate level athletes. Now we can see a tapering benefit in as little as 5 days, and sometimes they can last upwards of 5 weeks. That's why we've said it's inconsistent. There's no consensus. The benefit can last for a long time. It can happen almost immediately, and there's a lot of wiggle room in between. So what we usually say is for most athletes, kind of intermediate, moderately trained athletes, somewhere around 2 weeks is a good, safe zone in terms of the actual duration of the taper. Now, what we find is that the training age is probably the biggest confounder here. So those who are more trained, and I would also say more muscled, will require longer tapering periods simply due to the amount of homeostatic disruption that their training generates, right? So for those who are relatively new to sport, new to training, training less than a couple years, you can actually get an equal benefit of just doing something like a deload for a week or so, and that's good enough, right? They don't actually have to do a super crazy full tapering protocol for their competition, right? Which is actually kind of cool, and I wish that would apply to more people, but unfortunately it doesn't, because the less trained people, they simply just don't disrupt their own self as much. They're not as strong or as powerful, as fast or as enduring, so they bounce back really, really easy from training because their training's not that hard yet, which is fine, right? It would be nice if the rest of us could do that, but we can't because we take more recovery time. But what would be the benefit? Well, the benefit would be less time away from training, right? Because we said we have to take our training volume down to maintenance or below, essentially. That's time away from training. That's time I'm not getting better, right? So it's actually kind of beneficial for the beginner athlete. For more moderately trained intermediate athletes, we'd say somewhere around 2 weeks. For really, really well-trained people, we're talking about like 10 years or more of training, they might benefit for upwards of 3 weeks. And this is particularly true for our strength athletes, and then also for like short distance sprinting type events, people who are really, really powerful. But certainly for our strength athletes, we're talking like powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman. And then those who are at the top of their game, particularly for strength sports, might require 3 weeks or more to actually sufficiently recover from that training. Now, like I said, most of us, including your boy here, fall into that 2 week range, and that's a really, really safe place to start. If you check out our book, Scientific Principles of Strength Training, there's actually a really, really handy chart for tapering and peaking considerations for powerlifting that helps you narrow down where you actually fall into that. So that's another good reference if you're looking for something aside from the Mujica book. All right, let's move on to the next one. Couple things. You have to bring down, again, the training volume from all sources, and I've said that a lot of times, but it's one of the things that people forget the most, right? So we're thinking about volume loads from their weight training. We're thinking about the duration of time doing sport practice. The frequency might be affected as well. So if we're changing the frequency, that means we might have to adjust the volumes on certain days to make sure we're getting the same weekly volume, right? We know that the total volume reduction should be around 41 to 60% of pre-taper training volume. It should be brought down progressively, not necessarily like in huge chunks, though that asymptotic shape seems to work really, really well, but linear or stepwise are also good. We're going to maintain the intensity, possibly increase it, and that can be kind of where the art of coaching comes into play, because we know that as the intensity of the exercise rises, so too does the fatigue and possible risk of injury as well, right? So we want to make sure we're managing those things well. So at the very least, we're keeping the intensity roughly equal to what it was prior to the taper, possibly going up if tolerable. We're only going to bring down the intensity probably for the last 1 or 2 sessions prior to the competition. So we're saying the intensity is generally going to be maintained or increased throughout, except for that Thursday before the Saturday match, right? The last 1 or 2 sessions before that competition, then we're going to bring down the intensity just to make sure that we are addressing any lingering or remaining micro trauma to the muscle or to the connective tissue. The intensity plays a huge role in micro trauma management, so we're maintaining the intensity throughout, and then we're just making sure that any little bumps, bruises, sprains, strains are being addressed when we finally take the intensity down in the last 1 or 2 sessions prior to that competition. And this is at the very, very butt end of the taper, right? And then for most folks, that's going to be roughly 2 weeks, except for our really, really big muscular strength sport athletes like our powerlifters, weightlifters, strongmen, who might take 3 weeks or more depending on how big they are. So you can imagine somebody like Eddie Hall or Chad Wesley Smith, right? They're the ones who are going to take more than three weeks or more, not somebody like myself or people that you would see in the gym on a normal basis, right? Okay. Let's go on to the next one. So here's just kind of an example of what this would look like in the weight room. Now, granted, this is a very simplified example. Don't necessarily take it at face value, but here's one that I have used or kind of used as a basis, a foundation, and modified. So if we're doing a 2-week taper, here's kind of what we're going to see. The first week is going to be primarily just a volume reduction, meaning now we're starting to work on bringing the total training volume down. So that means we're going to either reduce the reps the sets or some combination of those two things, right? If we were working in a phase potentiated manner, like maybe for a strength power sport like rugby or soccer or something like that, what were we doing before we went to the taper? Were we probably in our specific prep phase, maybe you're in one of our competitive phases, they were probably doing either maximal strength or power speed type work. So I think kind of a safe starting point would be if we were pre-tapering, if we were doing something like 3x3s, right? It's a pretty safe bet. We would eventually transition in the taper into doing something like a 3x2 or 2x3, either way, right? We've brought the volume down pretty substantially, and we're going to maintain the relative intensity. So if we were at 85% of 3x3, now we're at 85% of 3x2 or something very similar to that, or 2x3. Either one's fine. So the first week, we're just bringing that volume down. Nothing too fancy, right? The week number 2, we're going to actually split it up into 2 chunks again. So week number 2, we're going to have a first half, which is going to be like either Monday through Wednesday or Monday through Thursday, something like that. And this would be like for a Saturday competition. That first half, we're going to reduce the sets and or reps again. So we went from 3x3 in the pre-taper. The first week we went to maybe 3x2 or 2x3. And then now in the first half of the second week, we're going to take that 3x2 or 2x3 and we're going to move maybe to like 2x2. So we reduce the sets and reps again. Now you might be looking at this like you only reduced it by 1 set or 1 rep, but you have to consider, right? We're talking about the pre-taper training volume. So if you were doing 3x3, removing 1 rep or 1 set is actually a very large reduction in the training load because you weren't actually doing that much to start with. So it actually fits into our model very well. So now we're doing something like 2x2, and of course we're maintaining the relative intensity throughout. The second half is kind of the icing on the cake or the cherry on top, right? So we're going to start reducing the volume, and then this time we're going to take the intensity down as well. So that 2x2 that we were doing in the first half of the week maybe goes to like a 2x1 or 1x2, and now we're going to drop off the intensity by the relative intensity by about 15 to 20%, again, to address any of that lingering micro trauma. So that last workout is laughable, right? We're saying like this is like really, really easy, beyond deload easy. This should be something really, really silly, really, really easy, right? And I've actually watched Alex Harrison when we were students together at ETSU do some of this stuff with maybe himself, but certainly with some of his athletes. And they would come in and do these just like pitifully light workouts, right? And people were like, what are you doing? But they had throwers who were actively competing like that weekend or very shortly thereafter. So they would come in and maybe just do some mid-thigh pulls or something really, really easy, just do like 1 or 2 sets of like a handful of reps and they were out. And that's a really good example of what this looks like in the real world. So again, it's not that we're trying to undertrain, it's that we are trying to drop out the accumulated fatigue. And the only way that we can do that is generally by reducing the training volume. The intensity will linger a little bit up until the last 1 or 2 sessions to, again, address any micro trauma that's still hanging around. So let's go to that last slide here. We know that the taper can have a profound effect on performance. It does a number of cool things to the physiology, to the psychology, and that generally translates to improved performance, right? We also know it's really important for maintaining our tolerance to training in the long term, so continuing to make gains when we get back to hard training. We know that there are some fine points, like in terms of frequency, or maybe the intensity manipulations, or what exercises, or what days per week are we working at. There's lots and lots of things you can play with. The only thing that you cannot screw up is you have to reduce the training volume. And again, it has to come from all sources, not just the weight room, not just on the practice field, not just the conditioning, right? All sources have to come down by about 41 to 60%, so roughly half. It's a lot. Other than that, there's a lot of wiggle room, right, in terms of how long it lasts, what style, whether you do exponential or stepwise or taper, whether you change the frequency, whether you maintain or increase the intensity. Those are things that you can wiggle around, and the art of coaching comes into play here. The volume has to come down. And again, I would encourage you to think about it critically. There is a clear benefit to tapering, right, which is usually an improvement in performance. However, there's also a clear cost, and that is time away from training, right? So it's probably not in one's benefit to taper, truly do a full tapering protocol, probably more than 2 or 3 times per year. And I would say 3 times being like, that's a lot. What are you doing? You probably have to be in a sport with multiple seasons like track and field, or rugby, or maybe like strongman if you're doing multiple events, for that to actually be beneficial. For most of us, we need to think about picking and choosing our battles wisely. And this is something that I've said multiple times, and now you're forced to listen to me say it because it's on camera, right? Pick and choose your battles wisely. You want to spend as much time training and getting better, bigger, faster, stronger, more fatigue resistant, leaner, better looking naked as much as you can, right? Tapering takes time away from that. Use it as like the ace up your sleeve when you have a really important competition that's coming up. Don't do it for competitions that don't matter. You're just robbing yourself of training time in the long term, right? So taper for competitions that have an effect on your standing within your organization or your sport, not for like South Philly open pizza time, beer chugging kind of stuff, right? All right, guys, that's my rant on tapering. I hope you enjoyed. Think about it and think about how you would incorporate that into some of your annual plans that you've probably been working on at this point. All right, I'm out for today. RPU, RP Plus. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed.